should make sure that America pays its bills and does not default on its debts. We need to raise the debt ceiling. Now is the time, Mr. President. Let us get to work. I yield back the balance of my time.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, someone wisely declared, after all is said and done, much more is said than done. A lot has been said in the well of this chamber this week. Unfortunately, not much has been done. On the other hand, Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Cantor and the members of the House of Representatives, including members of both political parties, have done much to end the shutdown and to protect the American people. The House has passed bills that would fund veterans' benefits and fund the National Institutes of Health. The House has also approved measures to make sure our National Guard gets paid and to keep our national parks open. The House funded WIC, the program that provides health care and nutrition for low-income women and their children. And the House has funded FEMA. All of these bills have, moreover, been passed with significant bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. At the risk of overstating it, I'm still, frankly, stunned at what we're hearing from some of my colleagues. It's difficult for me to understand their objections to passing these bills in the Senate. First, none of these bills is controversial, not one of them. The bills provide funding for non-controversial things like veterans' disability payments, the GI Bill, and cancer research. These bills keep our national parks open and make sure our National Guard personnel get paid. There are many things on which Republicans and Democrats disagree, but whether or not to take care of our veterans should not be one of them. And last I checked, it's not one of them. Second, the President himself asked Congress to do this. Republicans in the House took the President at his word and acted immediately to draft bills that would make sure his priorities and the nation's priorities would receive funding. In response, Senate Democrats said that this plan to fund veterans, national parks, and other priorities was unserious. They said Republicans were playing games. And the biggest head-scratcher of them all, the President issued a veto threat for bills that fund the very things that he said he wanted funded. Why won't the President and why won't Senate Democrats take yes for an answer? Why are they demanding that we have to fund everything? They tell us you have to fund everything or we will allow you to fund nothing. Third, all of these bills received significant bipartisan support in the House. In the middle of a government shutdown, surrounded by all of this divisive rhetoric, Republicans and Democrats came together in the House overwhelmingly to approve these bills. I think we owe it to the country to show that we can do the same thing in the Senate. Fourth, this approach, the approach that has been advocated by the House of Representatives, represents a path forward that was first introduced by none other than the distinguished Senate Majority Leader himself. On Monday afternoon, Senator Harry Reid asked for unanimous consent to pass a bill that ensured that our active duty military personnel would be paid in the event of a government shutdown. And in a matter of minutes, it was passed. I asked my friends across the aisle, was Senator Reid playing games? Was that unserious? Of course not. So why is it unserious when we try to fund veterans' disability payments or cancer research or the National Guard or national parks? Why is it all of a sudden playing games to keep our national parks open? What exactly has changed since Monday? Why can we come together to pass a bill funding military pay, but not to fund veterans' disability payments? And finally, none of these bills have any connection to the implementation of Obamacare. I understand that my friends across the aisle support that law despite its numerous and harmful failings. I understand they want to protect it. But none of the bills that we're considering relates in any way to the implementation of Obamacare. I'm concerned that my friends across the aisle cannot see this law for what it is and what it is already doing to American families all across the country. And now the government is shut down because Democrats refuse to work with us to do anything to protect the American people from the harmful, potentially devastating effects of Obamacare. They won't even consider passing bills to fund veterans' benefits, cancer research, or national parks unless Obamacare is fully funded and fully implemented. We have an obligation to address the negative effects of this law, but the Democrats refuse to negotiate. The President has issued a veto threat on funding for things that he himself asked Congress to fund because the bills don't include Obamacare funding, even though the programs funded in these bills have nothing to do with Obamacare. I fear that the Democrats are now simply the Obamacare party. It is the only thing that matters to them, even though it is hurting people throughout the country already and threatens to do so far more in the coming months. A recent report included a story of a man named Tom from Seattle, who signed up with the exchanges only to find out that his health care costs were going to skyrocket under Obamacare. I'll quote from the story. Tom of Seattle, who is self-employed, said, "My premiums would increase approximately 61%. I went from $891 a month to $1,437 a month. And also, my deductibles all doubled." The letter from his insurer said his current deductible for his family of 5 would double from $4,000 a year to $8,000. Even though that's for the bronze plan, the least expensive option under Obamacare, he says his additional payment of $550 a month will give him a plan that is no better than what he already has. What's more, it also carries a benefit for his family that his family doesn't need: maternity and newborn care. "My wife is 58 years old and our youngest child is soon to be 18, says Tom. "We'll be having no more children. That is a benefit that we would never purchase, nor need, or be able to use." These are the kinds of people we're trying to protect from this law. This is just one story among many stories. So I ask my friends, join us in ending the shutdown. Join us in protecting the country from Obamacare. And let's do the right thing for the American people. Leadership is not about what is said. Leadership is about what is done. And so I invite my colleagues to join House Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Cantor and the other House members who are leading, and they're leading by doing. We can and must lead. We can end the shutdown and simultaneously protect the American people from the harmful effects of Obamacare. We can do this. We must do this. And if we stand together in support of the American people, we will do this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
May I ask if the senator would yield for a question?
Yes.
Through the chair, let me inquire whether in evaluating the relative activity of the Senate and the House in trying to bring this shutdown to a conclusion, the senator would not concede that the Senate has repeatedly voted on House-passed measures. We have taken them up, stripped out extraneous language, and sent them back. We have tabled them. We have over and over again done our constitutional duty and voted. Now, the senator might not like the way the vote came out, but does he concede, A, that we voted on House-passed measures, and B, that the Speaker of the House has never yet called to the floor a Senate-passed measure and had a fair vote on the House side of the aisle?
In response to the question posed by my distinguished colleague, my friend from Rhode Island, yes, I'll acknowledge that we have taken votes, some votes in response to many of the pieces of legislation enacted within the House of Representatives.
And that the House has never reciprocated by taking up a Senate-passed bill.
The House has not voted on all of the things passed in the Senate, just as the Senate has not voted on all the things passed in the House.
Well, my question wasn't whether it has voted on some but not all. I think the fact is that the House has voted on nothing that the Senate has passed, nothing in this debate. They have done nothing but tee up political votes to send over to us.
That's not accurate. The House of Representatives has voted on things, sent them back in the form of messages, with some of those messages carrying 2 amendments that we then considered. I see your point. I see the senator's point. and it's a valid one in that we have had action taken in both houses. We have had votes cast in both houses. It is important, however, to recognize Republicans have offered significant elements of compromise in all of this. Republicans who have started from the standpoint that what they would like is repeal of the law, understanding that that's not possible under the current circumstances, sought first to defund Obamacare indefinitely. They sought that first. That was stripped out. That went back to them. They responded with a significant compromise offer, offering in the next go-around to defund it for a period of 1 year. That was sent back and that was rejected. There have been other elements since then that have been passed to fund parts of government, recognizing that there are a lot of areas in government spending as to which there is broad, bipartisan, basically unanimous consent in both houses and both political parties that we ought to be continuing to fund these things at current levels. They've acted in those areas, and the Senate has so far refused to go along with those. And so in the spirit of compromise, it would be helpful if we would act upon these. In the spirit of compromise, it would be helpful to have the Senate enact legislation funding those aspects of government as to which there is broad-based bipartisan support. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, my intention coming here was to help solve problems, to find common ground, to work together with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. That's my history, and in fact, that was my primary motivation for running, for stepping into the shoes of my illustrious predecessor, Olympia Snowe of Maine. And in fact, that's what we did this summer on student loans, when a small group of bipartisan senators worked together to find a compromise, work it through both sides of this body, both parties, and then through the House, and then get the signature of the President. We got 81 votes in the Senate, 392 in the House. That's what I want to try to do. That was a validation of what I'm here for. And this situation that we're in now cries out for resolution. It cries out for finding common ground, for compromising, getting everybody back to work, getting the government shutdown over. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we out cutting a deal? Why aren't we out compromising? Well, I've talked to my colleagues here in the Senate on both sides of the aisle, talked to House members, both Republicans and Democrats, and there are lots of options. And in fact, the House has sent us a series of options. The first one was essentially defund, effectively repeal, the Affordable Care Act. Then it was to delay the Affordable Care Act. Then it was to delay a part of the Affordable Care Act. But the important thing about these options and this discussion is it's all taking place in the context of a government shutdown. That's not where negotiations should be made. That's not where negotiation and discussion should be had when essentially the government has been shut down and one side is saying, we won't allow the government to operate unless you give us what we want on a substantive piece of legislation. This is the problem, Madam President. This is why I think in this one case, negotiation really isn't the right course. It's a process problem, it's a practical problem, and I believe it's a constitutional problem. It's perfectly appropriate to negotiate budgets. As a governor, I did it 4 times for biennial budgets and innumerable supplemental budgets, and it's perfectly appropriate to negotiate up to the deadline. Lots of late nights. That's when this work, for some reason, seems to get done. But in those contexts of budgets, of negotiating the most fundamental governmental document, you negotiate about numbers, about details, about allocations. You don't negotiate about entirely separate substantive pieces of law. And in fact, that happened a month ago right here when Leader Reid and Speaker Boehner negotiated a continuing resolution on what the number should be. And it was a hot and heavy negotiation. And the leader compromised. He said, let's go forward because we can do this cleanly with a continuing resolution at a lower level than the Senate Democrats felt was appropriate, than what was in that budget that was passed earlier this year. But that's not what's going on here. We're not negotiating about what are the dollar amounts of the budget, or what are the details, or what are the allocations, how much to defense and how much to Head Start. This is an attempt to rewrite a major piece of substantive law through holding the government hostage, which is a result that cannot be achieved through the normal democratic and constitutional processes. That's the core of this current situation. That's what's bothering me about it. I don't mind negotiating budgets. I do think we shouldn't use the threat of a government shutdown, or now the reality of a government shutdown, to obtain legislative and policy benefits that we can't otherwise obtain through the normal constitutional process. In a very real sense, Madam President, this is a frontal assault on the Constitution itself. Ironically, it's being led by many of those who wrap themselves daily in the Constitution. I don't have one of those books, but we all know those books, How a Bill Becomes a Law. I guarantee you can read those books till my father used to say, till the spots come off, but there's going to be nothing in there that says, well, if all else fails, hold the government hostage and then you can make a law. That's not what it says. Mary, my wife, got me a book when I was first elected called Congress for Dummies. Even in Congress for Dummies, it doesn't say you can make laws, change laws, rewrite laws in the context of holding the country hostage. It's an attempt to create an alternative process, a new shortcut way of achieving political ends without having to deal with those pesky elections. I mean, here's the electoral history of this bill. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act was passed in the early summer. There were elections in 2010, and indeed, the Republicans gained substantial seats in the House, probably because of concern about the Affordable Care Act. I'll concede that. But the Senate didn't turn over. By the way, that's the way the framers planned it. That's why there are 6-year terms here, so public passions in one electoral cycle don't entirely change the government. And then there was another election in 2012. In that election, in which the Affordable Care Act was a major factor, Democrats gained seats in the House, gained seats in the Senate, and the President, whose name is attached to this bill, won by 5 million votes. In my election in Maine, in every debate, and goodness knows there were probably over 20 of them, my Republican opponent started the debate by saying, I want to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That was the whole mission. And I defended it, not in every detail because I think it needs to be fixed, but I defended it and I won that election. And here I am. Mr. Romney said, I will repeal Obamacare on day one, but he lost. But here we are, Madam President, in effect trying to effectuate that agenda, that policy position, through an alternative process that skips around those annoying elections. The passionate opponents of this act are acting like those elections just didn't happen. Let's be clear about what this is. This is one faction of one party in one house of one branch trying to run the entire United States government. That's not the way our Constitution is supposed to work. And I'm confident of that statement because from talking to my friends in the House, I believe it's highly likely that if a clean continuing resolution, that means one without any strings, without any political baggage, without any repeal of the Affordable Care Act, went before the House today or tomorrow or Monday, it would pass. Most of the Democrats and enough Republicans to achieve a majority. And all this would be over. Speaker Boehner yesterday said two things that I think were important. One I agree with, one I don't. The one I agree with was he said this isn't a game. And it isn't a game. It's deadly serious. It's deadly serious because the impact this shutdown is having on our country. It's having on people throughout the country. In Maine, well, let's talk nationally, 70% of the civilians at the Department of Defense have been furloughed. 70% of our intelligence agency personnel are on furlough. I'm sorry, half the Department of Defense, 70% of intelligence. We've got air squadrons that are grounded. We've got people that are not being trained. And our defense industrial base is already suffering. In Maine, we've got 1,500 people on furlough at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, more coming at Bath Iron Works. And we're almost half of our National Guard people or on furlough. This isn't a game. But all of this is being done in the name of effectively repealing or crippling the Affordable Care Act. Even if you don't think it's a good law, this is not the way to go about dismantling it. It's not the way our Constitution is designed. Why won't we negotiate, though? Why aren't the Democrats negotiating on this and maybe nick the Affordable Care Act? Well, it reminds me of the story of a city guy that came up to a farmer in Maine, and he said, "I like the looks of your land. I'd like to buy your farm." Farmer said, "It's not for sale." City guy said, "Well, how about the 50% that's down there on the river? I'd like to buy that." "It's not for sale." "How about just the quarter acre where your house is on the road?" "It's not for sale." The city guy says, "Why won't you negotiate?" Because it's not for sale. This isn't the place or the time to negotiate. Listen, I think there are problems with the Affordable Care Act. I would love to sit down in good faith with people and try to fix them, starting with making the websites work better. But I think the way to do that is not in the context of the government being held hostage. And we don't have, and here's the real problem. If we do it now, this will become the normal way that we legislate around here. This is a 6-week continuing resolution. So we nick the Affordable Care Act in this one. Next time it's going to be, okay, we'll take another nick. Police.
Fired.
I ask unanimous consent that I have 4 more minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection, please proceed.
What I'm afraid of is this will become the normal way that we do things around here. Police and intelligence people and military officers tell you that you don't negotiate with hostage takers. The reason you don't is because you empower, you enable, and you ensure that it will happen again. That's what worries me. Our constitutional system has 2 principles in tension. One is governing, and the other is checks and balances. Governing is to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. And of course, checks and balances is the rest of the Constitution so that we aren't abused by our government. But if you take away the governing part, which is what a budget is, nothing's left but checks and balances. The framers thought of this. Madison in the 58th Federalist addressed it directly. He said it might be a good thing to have minorities have additional power above a quorum, but he says these are outweighed by the opposite scale. In all cases where justice or the general good requires new laws to be passed or active members to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed by minority rule. It would no longer be the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. Lincoln put it much more succinctly. If the minority will not acquiesce, the majority must, or the government must cease. There is no other alternative for continuing the government is acquiescence on one side or the other. That's what's at stake here, governing. I understand the opposition, although I frankly don't fully understand not wanting people to have health insurance. I understand the passion. I understand the attempt. I think the Speaker is a good man, and he wants to do the right thing. I understand the need to get something, to win something in this weird atmosphere where everybody has to win or lose. But they gave it their best shot. It didn't work. Let's move on. Let's have a clean vote in the House so the American people and the world know that we still know how to govern. I want to talk. I want to negotiate. I want to solve problems, but not at the expense of this institution, not at the expense of the Constitution, and not at the expense of the American people. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, yesterday the White House said it is, and I quote, winning the shutdown debate, and that it is, and I quote again, not concerned how long the shutdown lasts. Well, the Democrats may be content with playing political games. Republicans remain focused on finding a solution to reopen the federal government. And when the White House says it is winning, Madam President, maybe winning the political debate, winning the political game, if you will, it is the American people who are losing. The Obama administration said yesterday that it would support a measure providing retroactive compensation to furloughed federal workers, yet it continues to oppose funding for the National Guard and Reserve, veteran services, nutrition assistance for low-income Americans, FEMA, life-saving medicines and cures at the NIH, national parks and museums. Mr. President, what I would simply say is that there are bills that have been sent here by the House of Representatives that are available to be picked up by the Senate at any time. We could fund all those various things right now. The bills are from the House. All we have to do here in the United States Senate is pick them up, pass them, and there wouldn't be any objection on this side of the aisle. We could fund the National Guard and Reserve. We could fund veteran services. We could fund nutrition assistance for low-income Americans. We could fund FEMA. We could fund life-saving medicine and cures by funding the NIH. We could fund national parks and museums. It is that simple. Our colleagues on the other side consistently get up and talk about this particular program that's not being funded or this particular federal issue that's not being addressed right now in terms of funding. And it can all be solved that easily. All we have to do, Mr. President, is pick up the bills that have come over to us from the House of Representatives and pass them right now without objection on the Republican side. And all these things that are being talked about could be funded. It's that simple and that easy. I would hope that in the end there would be some of our colleagues on the other side that would agree with us that that's the simplest way to deal with the immediate crisis. We obviously have other issues at work, at play here that are going to be discussed, and I want to talk about one of those in just a minute. But in the meantime, if we're concerned about some of these important programs not being funded, we can do that right now. Things that benefit people in this country, people who would defend us, National Guard and Reserve, people who want to see our national monuments and our parks. We've heard stories about those not being available to people across this country. Well, it's very simple, Mr. President. Pick up the bills and pass them right now. But what I'd like to talk about, in addition to getting the government back up and running, Mr. President, is doing something to address our nation's debt. We find ourselves now in the 5th day of a partial government shutdown that, from my perspective, was completely avoidable. But, Mr. President, we know that the government shutdown is only one of the challenges that we're currently facing. The Treasury tells us that we're going to be reaching our debt limit in the coming days, which astonishingly stands at almost $17 trillion. So as we look at the near future, we need to address the debt limit and we need to end this partial government shutdown. And I think it's unavoidable now, Mr. President, that those two issues have sort of converged and come together. One time we were going to be talking about addressing one and then subsequently dealing with the debt limit. Now it looks like those are going to be all one big debate and discussion. But what I'm perplexed about is our friends on the other side of the aisle and the President who continue to insist that they're not going to negotiate on those issues. Mr. President, when the people of South Dakota sent me here to Washington, they did so with the expectation that I will continue to stand up for their values. They also know that when it comes to governing, there will be differences of opinion. Oftentimes that means we're going to have to sit down together with people on the other side of the issue to find common ground. But to say it's my way or the highway is not the way to approach these things.
Mr. President,
these are issues
Senator
that are
yield for a question.
to both individuals and our economy. And you just can't say we're not going to negotiate. That is not a viable or a reasonable position in the eyes of the American people. Mr. President, I want to just put a fine point on that. Earlier this week, the Majority Leader was quoted as saying, and I quote, this is the Majority Leader of the United States Senate, "The President said he's not going to negotiate on the debt ceiling. He's not going to negotiate. We aren't either. It's never happened in the history of the country." End quote. At the end of last week, while the President was out giving political speeches instead of engaging with Congress to solve these issues, the President made this statement, and again I quote, "And that's why I've said this before, I'm going to repeat it. There will be no negotiations over this." End quote. That's the President of the United States. There will be no negotiations over this. Reiterated by our friends here on the other side of the aisle in the United States Senate.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
I'd be happy to yield, Mr. President, when I've concluded my remarks on the Senator from Rhode Island's time.
Thank you.
Mr. President, what I would simply say is I think the reason that Republicans here in the Senate find this stance so perplexing is that characterization that we've never negotiated around a debt ceiling is absolutely not true. Deficit reduction measures over the last several decades have been paired with increases in the debt ceiling. Almost 30 years ago, we had the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, otherwise known as Graham-Rudman-Hollings. I was a staffer here at the time. That was done in the context of the debt ceiling. We've had several measures in the 1990s that reduced our deficits that were done in association with an increase in the debt ceiling. And most recently, we all remember this, the Budget Control Act of 2011, which resulted in restraint largely on the discretionary side of the budget, which many of us would like to change, but it's also resulted for the first time since the 1950s in 2 consecutive years where the federal government spent less than it spent the previous year. First time since the Korean War. The common denominator is that these deals were paired with an increase in the debt ceiling. So, Mr. President, the point I'm trying to make here is that for those of my friends who are arguing that negotiating around our debt ceiling is unprecedented, perhaps they ought to take a closer look at history. Now, this week, Kevin Hassett and Abby McCloskey of the American Enterprise Institute wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and it was entitled, "Obama Rewrites Debt Limit History," which I think characterizes the history of the debt limit in a more accurate way. And they write, and I quote, "According to the Congressional Research Service, Congress voted 53 times from 1978 to 2013 to change the debt ceiling." So 53 times in those 35 years of recent history. They go on to write that, and I quote again, "Congressional Republicans who want legislative conditions in exchange for a debt limit increase are following a strategy that has been pursued by both parties the majority of the time. Of the 53 increases in the debt limit, 26 were clean, that is standalone, no strings attached statutes. The remaining debt limit increases were part of an omnibus package of other legislative bills or a continuing resolution. Other times the limit was paired with reforms, only some of which were related to the budget," end quote. So to reiterate, Mr. President, out of 53 increases in the debt limit, less than half were what we call clean or standalone measures. The others had other legislation associated with them, in many cases omnibus package of legislative bills or continuing resolutions or deficit reduction measures. And to make that happen again, Mr. President, what we need is leadership. We need leaders on the other side of the aisle, including the President, to come to the table in good faith and to make the tough decisions. And I have to say, I find it concerning that instead of coming to the table this week, that the President has embarked on a media blitz suggesting that Republicans in Congress want to default on the debt. In an interview this week with CNBC's John Harwood, the President stated that he recently told representatives from the financial services sector visiting Washington that they should, quote, "be concerned." They should be concerned over a faction of Congress that is willing potentially to default. Well, in my view, Mr. President, these statements are both unproductive and misguided. Nobody wants a default. Nobody wants a government shutdown. And I can assure the President, my friends on the other side of the aisle, that Republicans here in the United States Senate couldn't agree more that those are things that we need to avoid. But what I would suggest is that instead of simply kicking the can down the road, instead of pushing the difficult decisions off until tomorrow, we've got to get serious about the long-term fiscal health of our country so that we can grow our economy and help strengthen our middle class. Rather than stoking fears that rankle financial markets and damage the economy, now is the time to move beyond politics and to work with congressional Republicans to make a significant down payment to address America's long-term debt problems. Republicans are seeking responsible and reasonable solutions. South Dakotans, and I think the American people, understand that choosing to do nothing when it comes to the debt that we're piling on the backs of future generations is not a responsible way to continue to govern our country. And I would pose to my Democrat colleagues that the Republicans stand ready to come to the negotiating table and act in good faith to get the government up and running again and to make responsible spending reforms that address the true drivers of our debt. And I hope that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will take a lesson from history and not suggest that we are not going to negotiate. That is not a viable position in the eyes of the American people. It is not a viable position if you want to work in a way that's going to lead to an accomplishment and a result here in Washington, D.C. on these issues and matters that are of great importance not only to today, but to the future of this country. And so, Mr. President, what I would simply say, again, as I said when I began, that having a position that we're not going to negotiate on government shutdown, we're not going to negotiate on debt limit increase is not only inconsistent with what the American people have said they want to see done here, because by the latest poll I saw, by a 2-to-1 margin, they think that we ought to be around the debt limit increase, figuring out what we're going to do about the debt. That's the American people think, but it's also unrealistic to think that we're going to be able to solve our problems. And it's inconsistent with what history has shown us in the past we have been able to accomplish when we're willing to sit down together in the context of raising the debt limit, which, by the way, will be over $17 trillion when this is all said and done. And I think when the American people believe that you're going to ask for another debt limit increase to raise that by perhaps another $1 trillion borrowing limit, they would like to see us do something meaningful to address that incredible, burgeoning, exploding federal debt that we're putting on the backs of our children and grandchildren. So, Mr. President, with that, I assume the senator from Rhode Island is up next, and if he would like on his time to ask a question, I would, through the chair, entertain that.
Senator from Rhode Island.
I thank the distinguished senator from South Dakota, and I noticed that he was on the floor during the remarks that the presiding officer now, the senator from Maine, made just a moment ago. And having heard those remarks, I would ask the senator from South Dakota if he would concede that there is a difference between negotiating and negotiating with hostages. Whether the hostage is shutting down the government or whether the hostage is defaulting on the United States obligations, there is a difference between negotiating and negotiating while holding hostages.
I would say through the chair, Mr. President, to my colleague from Rhode Island, that I think what makes a negotiation successful is when both sides are sufficiently motivated. And it strikes me, at least, that if you're going to have a successful outcome, that both sides have to have incentives to be at the table. I think Republicans have indicated very clearly that we believe that one of the ways in which we get legislation, policy put in place that's good for the future of this country is to do it around a debt limit increase. Historically, that's been the case. That's been a precedent. It's very clear, as I mentioned, throughout the course of modern history, that many of the big budget agreements that we've reached have been done in the context of a debt limit increase. And so I would suggest to my colleague from Rhode Island that whatever the motivation is for getting people to the table, we just need to get to the table. And, you know, we've had a lot of, on both sides of the aisle, I would say in fairness, people questioning each other's motives. But we're in a pretty tough spot right now. We've got a government that shut down. We need to get reopened. We have a debt limit that we're going to hit here in the next couple of weeks. And I would hope that we can sit down in good faith and figure out where we can find a common path forward that would allow us to govern in a responsible and a reasonable way, but to address what I think are really the big issues facing the future of this country.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would note that the President and Leader Reid have both indicated a very open willingness to negotiate on virtually anything, but in light of the difference that the presiding officer pointed out on the floor a moment ago between good faith negotiating under our established constitutional procedures and negotiating while holding hostage either the continuing operation of the federal government or a United States default on its obligations for the first time in history, that difference does indeed bear on this discussion, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, today marks the 5th day of this shutdown, and I come to the Senate floor once again to call on the House of Representatives to take up the Senate bill. It is a simple bill. It has no bells and whistles. It simply says, let's open the government again. Let's open all those monuments. Let's open up the research that's going on that's so important to save lives at the National Institutes of Health. Let's put our intelligence employees that every day putting themselves at risk trying to gather that data, let's put them back to work. And then let's take those 6 weeks to do what the senator from South Dakota was talking about, to negotiate a bigger deal, a budget deal. One of the things that I've been concerned about is that the Senate has in fact passed a budget. The House has in fact passed a budget. But our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will not let those two budgets go to conference committee like they're supposed to do so we can work out the differences, have a long-term solution. But the solution is not to shut the government down. Now, what has happened? The senator from Maine, the presiding officer, did a good job of reviewing what has gone on the past few weeks. First, we passed a sensible bill to keep the government open at low spending levels, the sequestration levels, as we call them here, with the spending cuts included, because we knew that that was a compromise, but we knew that was a way that we could get our friends from the other side of the aisle to agree to have a further negotiation period. Instead, we got back a bill that would have delayed the Affordable Care Act, something that they knew very well that the President would veto, that the Senate wouldn't agree to. Now we've gotten a series of things where they've agreed to keep certain agencies open, sort of government by whack-a-mole, right? One problem comes up, okay, we'll hit that, we'll get that one done. Oh, maybe there's a big merger that's been proposed that has antitrust problems and could cost consumers money. Maybe we'll put a few antitrust lawyers on. Oh, I guess there's an imminent threat going on right now, so let's add a few intelligence officers. Let's handle that one. Maybe there's a foodborne illness problem that's developed in part of the country. Maybe we have to put some of those Center for Disease Control employees back on. That is no way to govern a business. That is no way to govern the greatest nation on earth. We are a democracy that's been a model for the rest of the world, so this is not the answer. So what's the next thing we got? Well, today we found out that they have voted to pay furloughed workers. That's something I support. That's something most of the senators here support. Okay, but does this really make sense that they would decide to do that today and then not also vote to put them back to work? So they are essentially deciding that they're going to pay them, which I support, that they're going to pay them, but they're going to pay them to stay at home. This doesn't make sense in Lanesboro, Minnesota. This doesn't make sense in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. They believe that the federal workers have been hired to do a job, and it's time to put them back to work. And that's what this debate is about. These are the things, Mr. President, that I've been hearing from my constituents, just some random letters that came in on our email system over the last few days. Here's a letter from Jason of St. Paul. He says, I'm a Minnesota resident currently on active duty in the U.S. Navy on deployment in the Middle East for my second tour. As a military member, if I did not do my job, I'd be putting the lives of my friends and fellow military members at risk. At home, he's a Navy reservist on active duty. At home, I'm a full-time professional firefighter, an EMT for the St. Paul Fire Department. If I chose to fail on my duties in that job when a fire call came in, people would die. Similarly, the shutdown of the U.S. government, and he says, I know it happened in the House and the Senate has passed a bill. Sorry, he adds that. But he says the shutdown of the U.S. government is unacceptable. I work in a coalition office with several other European officers from other navies, and I'm embarrassed at what I see from the Congress. I urge you with all of my being to work to resolve this. I'm confident that you can get the job done. Next, Lisa from Oakdale, Minnesota. Senator Klobuchar, I'm 39 years old and have never contacted a representative until now. I felt compelled to do so today because as a federal civilian employee, I want to express my extreme disappointment. I have dedicated my career to federal service, which I am now considering changing given this unfairness. Please work to resolve the budget as quickly as possible so my husband and I can return to work. That's what Lisa said. That's what Lisa said. And you know what? Now the House of Representatives said rightfully so they would pay her while she's at home. But they didn't send her back to work. They didn't do what she asked for in this letter. They didn't send her back to work. She simply wants to do her job. Here's from Pamela, Young America, Minnesota. Farmer, please do whatever you can to stop the government shutdown. We have 14 acres of land enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, and our rental payment is to be made to us this first week of October. As long as the government shutdown is in place, our Conservation Reserve Program payments are delayed. We depend on this money, and is not a small amount for our family. There are many farmers and landowners in the same situation. Please stop the shutdown. Well, I hope the House of Representatives is listening to Pamela of Young America, Minnesota today. Kathy Tomlinson from Minnesota. I am an employee of the Social Security Administration, Office of Disability and Review. I have seen you intervene, Senator, on matters for claimants who have disability hearings pending. I am furloughed as part of the government shutdown. If you want your constituents' hearings addressed, I need to be at work in my office. Is she talking about pay in this letter? Of course she wants her pay, and she's going to get her pay, and she should. But that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about doing her job and getting back to work. Yet today, the House of Representatives voted to pay workers to stay home. Okay, we want to pay them, but not to put them back at work when that is all she's asking to do. Alicia from Hastings, Minnesota. Dear Senator Klobuchar, I'm writing to express my extreme concern over the federal government shutdown. I'm a teacher, a mother of 3 boys, and a wife of a furloughed veteran who works for the Minnesota Air National Guard. I have never before written a letter to my representative, but feel so utterly helpless and frustrated at this time, I needed to voice my concern. My concern at this time is that those in Congress have forgotten about people like me, like those in my family and those in my community. I feel like an inconsequential number, a nameless and faceless casualty in a game that has no winners. I'm concerned that my family's experience is lost in the rhetoric exchanged between party members. I'm concerned that we are the forgotten and nameless, collateral damage in a philosophical debate. At this point in time, my husband, who is a veteran working full-time for the Minnesota Air National Guard, is out of work because he is a federal employee not deemed essential. I'm afraid that not only are the other 800,000 laid-off federal employees deemed non-essential, but the rest of the American citizens are non-essential as well. Our struggles are real-life struggles, not a game, not philosophical, not in theory, not distant, and not imaginary. My hope is that those struggles and hardships matter to you and in a real way. I'm hoping you will understand the urgency of this situation for my family and for the thousands of others whom you directly impact on a daily basis. I don't want any representatives to forget the real people affected by these decisions. That's your duty, that's your charge, that's your enormous task. I hope that I can count on you to look out for my family and the many others. I hope you will consider our lives and our hardships. Thank you for your efforts to solve this situation. She doesn't want to be inconsequential. She doesn't want to be non-essential. Not just her husband who's furloughed, but her as a citizen of this country. Again, was she asking for money? Of course they want to get paid, and they will get paid. But that's not what this is about. This is about her husband getting back to work to do the duty that he was hired to do by the American people. This is a simple bill. It just simply allows them to go back to work. And I am heartened by the fact that the number, I think it's at 22 House members now on the Republican side have said they want to vote on this Senate bill. That's a magic number. That's enough to pass it. We have to let that bill come up for a vote. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I rise today in order to talk about the impact of the current government shutdown on Hawaii's federal workers. Here in Washington, we debate in what most people consider abstractions. We use terms like Obamacare, filibuster, discretionary spending. We talk about government programs and initiatives in the aggregate and in the abstract. Hardly a day goes by when we don't hear about some program costing in the millions and billions. And while we use these terms and concepts when debating the nuts and bolts of government policy, what we need to always keep in mind is that these dollars and these terms impact real people, real lives. The work of the U.S. Senate is to debate and deliberate with the goal of finding consensus solutions to the challenges our nation faces. And the core of what we do is about people, families, and communities. When we get away from thinking this way, when we focus on the abstractions and the slogans and who's winning the day's media war, it becomes easy to forget what we're all here for. And when we forget that, we find ourselves unable to move forward and find consensus. We lose focus on the people, families, and communities that sent us here. Public service is a privilege. It is also a responsibility. when we stand for election or enter public service in some other way, we are committing to put ourselves in the back, behind the people for whom we work and serve. So today, as we mark another day of the government shutdown, I'd like to share some stories with my colleagues, stories about people and families affected by the shutdown. I have received letters, like my colleague from Minnesota has received letters from her constituents, from people of all ages, serving in different capacities at different federal government agencies, and even some who are just embarking on a path to public service. These are all people dedicated to their work and dedicated to their country. The damage we are doing by not getting these folks back on the job is serious and impacts our national security, our economy, and a host of necessary services that the people of our country depend upon. And this shutdown and the debate around it is undermining a commitment to public service for many people. It is damaging the effectiveness of our institutions, and it is unnecessarily putting many families in Hawaii and across the nation in a state of uncertainty and anxiety. One furloughed man who wrote to me expressed these views clearly. He said, "As a U.S. Air Force civilian, I am a furloughed employee. Hawaii has nearly the highest percentage of federal workers. This has a huge impact on the Aloha State. Unlike the recent sequester, one can't scale back when nothing is coming in. Some lower-grade workers may lose their homes, and with it their sense of pride for choosing to work for the government. That's the reality of this shutdown." He went on, "By October 9, we'll have lost more than the recent sequester cuts. Many have not overcome that, and now we're summarily discharged. And the debt ceiling debate is next. I work in an office of 10 or so, half active duty, half civilian. We provide the continuity needed year in, year out to manage instrument procedures at all our bases in the Pacific Air Forces." And he goes on, "Are we non-essential employees?" I respectfully ask Speaker Boehner to ask them. I'm upset that a few politicians are holding my country, my community, and yes, my family hostage for political brinksmanship. "I stand with you, Leader Reid," he said, "and the responsible Republicans in the U.S. House that want to get our nation moving again." Another constituent wrote to me about the impact of the shutdown on her family. She said, "As the wife of an essential personnel government employee, I would like to tell you that the shutdown is devastating. We are parents of 3 children, one of whom is special needs and requires expensive measures daily to survive. Without a paycheck, we will be unable to pay our bills, buy food, support our children. Many middle-class federal employee families are in the same boat. Savings will not support us indefinitely. My husband is, right now, as we speak, at work, doing his duty, protecting the American public against foodborne illness and contamination. Yet he is doing it with no pay. We are devastated. Please, please, tell our story. Tell the Republicans who have not crossed the aisle to please be reasonable and fund the government. They can argue later. Children are paying the price for the shutdown." Mr. President, as of right now, at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, 3 of our nation's nuclear submarines are in dry dock, and work on them stopped due to the shutdown. And one of the shipyard workers wrote this to me. "Maisie, I am an employee of Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard. The shutdown has left my coworkers and myself with a sense of trepidation, insecurity, and angst. Most of the hardworking, dedicated, and patriotic federal civilian employees I work with live paycheck to paycheck due to the high cost of living in our islands. I have fears of not being able to pay my mortgage on time in November. But more importantly, the operational readiness of our Pacific Fleet is in jeopardy because we aren't able to keep our ships fit to fight if we can't go to work, repair them, and meet scheduled deadlines for returning them to operational status. Our workload already is stretching our resources and demanding we perform more with less. How can we recover a day, a week, a month, or more sitting at home when so much is at stake? The long-term consequences of this shutdown has ripple effects that are not one-for-one, but a much longer period when moving a large industrial workforce back into a rhythm of productivity and efficiency. Please continue to work with your colleagues in Congress and convince them to end this shutdown sooner rather than later. This letter is an example of the selflessness of so many workers. While he is concerned about himself and his colleagues, his greater concern is for the impact this shutdown will have on our nation's security. I've also received letters from people just starting out in life and in public service. For example, one young woman wrote me, "I am in jeopardy of losing my AmeriCorps Vista placement, which would prevent me from developing essential workplace skills and an education stipend that would lighten the load of my student loan debt." And another shared this. "My husband and I are closing on our first condo today, Tuesday, October 2nd, and now are faced with the challenge of my husband not receiving a paycheck during the shutdown. He is a government employee who is expected to work during the shutdown without a payday in sight. I am extremely nervous now about paying our mortgage and other essential bills when I should be excited about our first home purchase. I know eventually this will be straightened out, but at what cost to us? We are both in our early 30s, trying to make a life together, and like many obstacles, this is yet another setback. I hope this comes to an end quickly." Mr. President, these are people just starting to make their way in the world. They are working hard and doing all the right things. Yet, through no fault of their own, they are facing uncertainty and are likely questioning whether they've chosen the right path. The last letter I'd like to share today, and I'll be sharing more in the coming days about other areas of Hawaii's economy that have been impacted, is one that I hope my colleagues will think about as we go forward. This couple wrote, "My spouse and I are both federal employees with a combined public service commitment of over 50 years. We have seen and lived through many congressional sessions and many more shenanigans, but neither of us can recall a time when the truculence of a few has caused so much hurt in the lives of so many. I am essential. My husband is not. We will get by. Others are not so lucky. Our administrative assistants, for example, both of whom are barely hanging on, trying to feed their kids on the same pay that they received 3 years ago, while the costs of health insurance, transportation, and housing have continued to rise, are now not being paid at all. Our daughter, for example, over $200,000 in student loan debt, who tends to our veterans as a physician in a VA hospital, still had to come up with her rent on Tuesday and still has to pay for healthy food and quality daycare so she can go to work but not get paid. Mr. President, these people devoted their careers to serving the public, helping people, and making our country a better place. I ask my colleagues to think, how long will this couple's daughter or the administrative assistants that they mention in their letter can continue to hang on and stay in public service? If our political system can't function, our institutions and the people that work in them and rely on their services suffer. And one of the most damaging legacies of this shutdown could be the crisis of confidence that it will create among the American people towards their own government. That would be devastating. I'm not arguing that government should be the answer to all of our problems, provide all of our services, but the services it does provide should be worthy of the people, families, and communities we are providing them for. Having a dedicated federal workforce is central to that goal. And our job as senators is to give that workforce confidence that their work is valued, that they are valued, that their contributions are worthwhile. This shutdown fails miserably in all of those respects. We have the privilege of serving in the United States Senate. Let's do our job for the people all across our country who, like all these people who wrote to me and who wrote to all my other colleagues, expect nothing less of us. Let's reopen the government. Speaker Boehner, let the House vote on the bill that the Senate sent to you. And let's get back to working on what we can do better to better serve the people, families, and communities that gave us the privilege to be here. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Hawaii for her comments and say that on the basis of what this senator just discovered, having gone down to the other end of the Capitol, Senator Hirono, it's going to take a lot of loud voices to get the Speaker to hear us, because they have shut down. They have gone home. They're not even coming back until next Monday. And I was just wandering through this deserted Capitol. I encountered Congressman Steny Hoyer, one of the great leaders of the United States Congress, the minority whip, now used to be majority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives, and so he just gave me this report. Those chambers down there at the other end are darkened. And here we are. And on the basis of a small group of people in the House of Representatives who insist on having it their way or no way, we have all of these people and all of the specific events that all of these senators have chronicled of the deprivation, of the lack of security. I mean, you can go on as a result of the shutdown, and this senator is going to enumerate a few examples of that. While the two senators from Hawaii and the senator from Wisconsin are here, our great presiding officer, one of the bright lights of the new class that just came in to the Senate, if you really examine what is the problem is it actually goes back to the Hebrew Scriptures. When in the Hebrew Scriptures, two commands that then were reiterated by Jesus in the new Scriptures. First commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And there was a practical how-to, and that we know is the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. That is a practical application of the second great commandment of love your neighbor as yourself. And it is part of the root of the problem of what we see that's not only gripping the capital city of the United States, where people are so ingrown and insular and unwilling to respect the other fellow's point of view and work out your differences, the very underpinnings of the greatness of our democracy that has lasted over 2¼ centuries is on that basic principle of treat others as you would want to be treated. In other words, in the political context, do what Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan used to do. Have your fights, but at the end of the day, you respect each other, so when it's time to do the deal, you can come together and resolve your differences. Another great modeling for this senator when he was a young congressman was the two leaders in the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker, and Bob Michel, the Republican leader. And it's the same kind of relationship that Tip had with the president. They'd fight like the dickens during the day, but they kept that personal respect through a personal friendship, so that even though they vigorously disagreed about an issue, they realized that they were not the only ones in this country, and that there were other people who thought differently than them. And in the grand tradition of American democracy, that when it was time to build a consensus, to achieve a workable solution, then they could come together and work it out. But what we see is a small, very, I would dare say, totally inward-looking group that thinks that they know it all and that their opinion is the only opinion, and that because they have the political leverage, since the Speaker of the House has said that he will only pass something with Republican votes. By the way, it didn't used to be that way. They now call that the Hastert rule, named after the Speaker Hastert. Well, before that, it didn't used to be that way. We used to pass things in the House of Representatives with Republican and Democratic votes. And I give you that great example. I want to give you one of the finest examples of government being able to work during a time of economic emergency. And it was in 1983. We were within 6 months of shutting down Social Security, because Social Security was starting to run out of money where it could not make its full payments. It would have made partial payments. And those two old Irishmen, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, they said, we're going to fix it. And what we're going to do is, first thing, we're going to take this iron rail of American politics, we're going to take it off the table to be used as a hammer to beat your opponent over the head with in the next election. And then we're going to appoint a blue ribbon panel, and they're going to bring back their recommendation to the Congress, and we're going to pass it. And all of that occurred, and it passed overwhelmingly, and it made Social Security actuarially sound for the next half century, well into the 2030s, all the way from 1983. That's an example of the finest traditions of governing under the American constitutional method in our democratic systems. And so when you get at loggerheads in a time like this, where is that respect, that genuine, not that superficial respect, not that respect that, fortunately, we show to each other out here on the floor of the Senate, but where is that genuine respect? And where is that recognition, Mr. President, those words right up there, scrolled in the marble, e pluribus unum, out of many one, that we gain our unity from many people's many ideas, but we all think of ourselves unum as one, as Americans. Now that's what we're missing. And you boil all this down, That's what's going on in American politics today. We don't talk to each other, we're shouting past each other. Turn on your TV cables. Look at the shouting matches there. Or turn on one cable and you get only one perspective. Turn on another cable, you get another perspective. We're not talking to each other. We're not. Also, as the good book says, as Lyndon Johnson, as president, often reminded us, come, let us reason together. That's what's happening. Mr. President, I see other senators that want to speak here. I've got a whole bunch of things that I wanted to enumerate that are happening in the state of Florida, where the shutdown of the federal government is affecting the state of government. I'm not going to list those things so that my colleagues can go on and speak. I've got a bunch of things to talk about national security, where we are genuinely harmed today with the shutdown of the government. And I want to point out that one of our military commanders, it happens to be a tanker unit, you know, the big KC-135s, tankers, they fly, they refuel all of our aircraft so they can refuel in the air. He says, quote, we are effectively shut down. And another commander of another active duty wing, Colonel DeThomas, says that when you take the furloughs, these furloughs now, on top of the 6 days that they lost unpaid in the sequester in the last fiscal year, which ended September the 30th, when he says you do that, he says it creates a double whammy. That's what's happening, and that's just one little snippet of our national security. So, Mr. President, I'm so glad that these colleagues are here to speak, and I will share all the details that I intended to share at a later time. I thank the Senate for their attention, and Mr. President, I yield the floor.